Hello guys. I'll be going through period 1, which is units 1 through 3, and this is period 1 for the LEQs. So there's 3 LEQs. This will be one of the options, and this is the one I think I'm going to write about. But basically period 1 is mainly has the American Revolution. It has the Enlightenment, the First Great Awakening. It also has in period 1, in unit 1, there's the Native Americans before Columbus colonized in 1492. But the big ideas is the American Revolution. It's the transatlantic effect, the Enlightenment principles on America and its Constitution, and also all these acts regarding why the United States decided to revolt against its mother country, England. Also, like the colonists, like who is coming to America, why are they coming to America, what reasons for like religious freedom, for economic purposes, like joint stock companies. So I'm just gonna walk through that. I actually have a study guide, so I'll just go through and explain the topics, and then we can go through that. So 1491, when you think that year, that's the year before Columbus arrives in America, San Salvador, and meets the Taino Indians in 1492. Before that, Native Americans were already there. They were discovering, these great, they're creating very diverse, very complex societies based on their environment and adapting to and transforming the environment around them, right? We have the Great Plains people, which, let me pull it up, American societies. So we have a lot of different places. As you can see, we have the Great Plains. If I can click this. Yeah, so we have the Great Plains. These are known for their very pronounced lack of natural resources, which means the Native Americans here, like the Lakota Sioux people, they developed a very nomadic lifestyle. They mostly like hunted buffalo as their principal food source. They moved around. Their teepees, very mobile, very nomadic. And also, the introduction of horses from the Spanish would greatly help them be more efficient with buffalo hunting instead of having to hunt on foot. The Southwest, basically, the Southwest is heavily influenced by the spread of corn from Mexico, north from Mexico. Basically, corn or maize allows for the establishment of complex settled societies, like permanent societies. So the Southwest, like the Pueblo people, they really take advantage of that. They build very complex societal structures. They're settled permanently. They focus more on agriculture rather than hunting, gathering, like moving around so much. And an example of this is the Pueblo people. They built homes on the ledges of the Mesa Verde. For example, they lived in these little ledges. And they developed complex irrigation systems to help with growing corn. They did 3 sister crops, which is basically 3 sister crops is beans, squash, and something else, I think. If my Google decides to load, I do have a bunch of tabs open. But corns, beans, and squash, which was a companion planting method because they nurture each other, and they're a staple of Native American agriculture. So corn, beans, and squash. And remember, corn is super for Native American societies. So corn, definitely. There's other people, of course, coast of California. They're doing fishing near they're like the Tlingit, the Chinook people, like the Pacific seaboard. Those people are very focused on, ocean, like fishing. And yeah, so basically the main idea is even before Columbus arrived, the Native Americans are a very complex society. They're very diverse. They're not just like, oh, Native Americans, what you think, they're very diverse, and they have their own cultures. But then the arrival of Europeans came, and that was in 1492, Christopher Columbus, of course. But the Spanish crown, basically, Isabella and Ferdinand, they sponsored an Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus, and mainly their 3 goals were God, glory, and gold. Gold, God, and glory, the 3 G's. And Spain, under this time, they had completed their Reconquista under the Spanish crown, which was Ferdinand and Isabella, and they were united under Catholic Protestantism, not Catholic, under Roman Catholicism. And around the same time, in like 1517, England had completed the Protestant Reformation, or was undergoing the Protestant Reformation, which united England under like Protestantism. So those are two very diverging powers or versions of Christianity, and both these European countries, Spain and England, sought to expand their version of Christianity. So Spain did a lot of missionary systems. So that's one reason they wanted to go and explore the New World. They also wanted to find a sea route to Asia, because the overhead land route was blocked by the Ottoman Turks. It was very dangerous. They imposed high fees. So obviously glory as well for their nation, for explorers. But yeah, they wanted to extract wealth. So the Spanish, in South America, there were the Aztec and Inca and Mayan empires. These were super big. Aztec had like 200,000 people, and they were just obviously very complex societal structures, of course, irrigation, all that good stuff. There, South America, very, very advanced. But the reason it was Cortez conquered the Aztecs, and Pizarro conquered the Incas. The reason they were mainly able to do that was because diseases like smallpox and measles, they basically wiped out a lot of the native population, which made it way easier to subjugate and conquer them. So yeah, they implemented the encomienda system, which is basically like a feudal system. So basically, some Spanish people, they get land and they get the natives there as well to work. It was basically a form of subjugation, a colonial labor system. Conquistadors are granted the labor of indigenous peoples in exchange for really like giving them Christian instruction, like Christianizing them, and keeping them safe. But normally they didn't do that. They just subjugated, exploited, and abused the indigenous population. So there were a few people that stood up against this. One example is like the Valverde debates. Encomiendas. It was not Valverde. It was like, the Valladolid debates. Basically, Bartolomé de las Casas versus Juan Cines de Sepulveda or something. Let me see. Yeah, Juan Cines de Sepulveda. Basically, Bartolomé de las Casas said that Native Americans should not be subjugated. That was bad. Like, don't do that. And Juan Cines de Sepulveda was like, you should suppress them. Like, they're like below us, and they should be our laborers. So, yeah, but a lot of people use their Christian faith, like Christianizing them, as justification for why they should be able to enslave them. And this led to the Black Legend, which is basically like very anti-Spanish, anti-Catholic propaganda piece. So you don't really know if this is true or if it's just like propaganda against the Spanish, because ironically the English settlers are also crueler to the Native Americans. So yeah. French and Dutch colonization, mainly they were there for fur. Christianity, of course, as well. They were less violating of France emphasized on fur, so they actually intermarried with the Native Americans because they wanted to gain access to fur trade routes. And from the intermarriage came a new race, which is the Métis, which is a combination of French and indigenous cultures. The Dutch were also mostly profit-oriented. They weren't really looking to conquer or settle. The Columbian Exchange was another big factor contributing to European success. It was exchange of goods, ideas, crops, cattle from the New World to the Old World, especially diseases as well, like smallpox, measles. It decimated like up to 90% of Native American populations, and also helped Spanish colonization, definitely. And so, however, because like smallpox killed a lot of Native Americans, colonizers from Europe decided to switch to like African labor instead. So that was kind of bad. And then Unit 2, 1607. So 1607 is the foundation of Jamestown, which is the first permanent English colony. And 1754 is the end of the French and Indian War, which is basically a really big turning point for the American Revolution. So Chesapeake colonies, they were mainly joint stock companies, which basically investors pool their money and hope to share the risk and eventually gain some profit. The Virginia system, they established the head right system, which is basically like you get 50 acres of land for every person you bring on there. And this also established indentured servants, which were basically like young, single, poor people. And they worked for like normally 4 to 7 years to pay off their passage. And because of this, there was a huge poor population in England as indentured servants. And then once they got their land, they normally got the bad land, which was like near the frontier or near the Native Americans, which would ultimately lead to the Bacon's Rebellion later on. But 1619, first African slaves came on a Dutch ship, I think. But it wasn't until later, which is Bacon's Rebellion, mostly that colonists or Chesapeake colonists would become more dependent on slavery. But obviously we know about the horrible Middle Passage. African slaves were really cramped on that. There's like hundreds of people. It was a horrible journey. It's mostly from West Africa to the Americas. Americas engaged in this triangular trade system. So triangular trade is basically a system of transatlantic trade that connects Europe, the Americas, and Africa. So basically, from us to England or to Europe, we give them raw materials. They exchange that manufactured good for enslaved Africans. We also get manufactured goods, and we also get enslaved Africans by the transatlantic trade. West Indies, of course, as well. They are heavily slave labor because they really focus on cash crops, which are very labor intensive. But yeah, in triangular trade, African monarchs, they get English manufactured goods like guns in exchange for their slaves, and also colonial slaves would produce products like tobacco, and it would be sent to England for distribution in Europe. And then also with the rise of this came the rise of chattel slavery. So before slavery was like prisoners of war. It was just like if you did something bad or if you lost, you'd be taken as a prisoner of war. It's non-hereditary. It's not based on race. But in the 1660s, the House of Burgesses made it so that the child born from a slave mother and like a white father would be a slave. So it's hereditary. And also sexually abusing enslaved women was profitable for slave owners because you get more slaves. So, obviously, Jamestown was founded in 1607. It was the first successful English colony in the Americas, founded by the Virginia Company, with the hope that it would benefit joint stock investors. So, a big thing to note is that Jamestown is very profit-driven. It's a very economic motive. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, they faced starving time, where basically 2/3 of colonists died due to disease, drought, and starvation. Remember, a lot of the colonists here, they were really looking for money, so they didn't really know how to farm and stuff. But thankfully, John Smith, super strict governor, he got them back on their feet. And there were also some conflicts between the Powhatan tribes and Jamestown settlers, which culminated in the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, where the English victory destroyed Powhatans in this area. And as a resolution, Native Americans were granted reservation land. So basically, John Rolfe, he was a successful tobacco planter. He mixed tobacco strain with like a Brazilian strain. He was very successful. He married Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan. And basically, tobacco, which became Virginia's main cash crop and attracted even more indentured servants. It was super labor intensive. Basically, later, House of Burgesses in Virginia was established, first representing government in English North America, although it mainly reflected the will of the planter elites rather than like the common white men. But Bacon's Rebellion also happened, so basically these poor indentured servants, after they served out their servitude, they would get some land in the frontier, very bad, rocky soil land that was hard to plant, and they were very near Native Americans, so there was a lot of conflicts arising. So Bacon, which was Nathaniel Bacon, he wanted support from the government against the Native Americans. So he went to Governor William Berkeley, And Berkeley was basically like, no, like, we're making money from the natives from trading. We're not going to support you guys. Like, don't fight them. But they led a rebellion. Bacon led a rebellion where he basically burned down the Native Americans and burned down Jamestown. So basically, after Bacon's rebellion, that led to people fearing indentured servants, like, rising up. And that led to a shift away from indentured servitude to West African slave labor. And they also had slave codes, which was modeled after white supremacy. Maryland, this was basically a Catholic religious haven under Cecilius Calvert. They issued the Maryland Act of Toleration, which was the first, like, religious act toleration that granted freedom to all Christians, just Christians though. And then, tobacco, headright system, and this led to a lot of encroachment on natives, which would obviously lead to a lot of different conflicts. But New York is New Amsterdam. It was first founded by the Dutch, but later the England took it over and changed it to New York. Pennsylvania was William Penn, super Quakers. They were very religiously tolerant, very diverse. Pennsylvania, New York, New England. Pennsylvania and New York were like the middle colonies, so they were like sandwiched between the New England colonies up here and the southern colonies down here. So they were super diverse because obviously they were in the middle. A lot of religious tolerance. You have like Penn's Woods, Pennsylvania. Quaker values, which was a society of friends. They very heavily liked religious freedom, equality of everyone, good relationships with Native Americans. New England colonies, these were Puritans. These were mostly religiously focused, I guess. Puritans thought that the Anglican Church was not able to be, they wanted to purify it from within. They thought it could be purified, but it had too much Roman Catholic traditions, too reminiscent of the Catholic Church, which made it impure. So they basically went to New England and established like a city upon a hill, which was John Winthrop. He wanted the Puritan society to be a model for all societies. And so they came in the Great Migration, which is, I don't really know what that is. Great Migration. APUSH, Puritans. So the Puritan Great Migration was basically the mass movement of English Puritans, around 20,000 Puritans from England to North America, mainly the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Great Migration. Cool. And then, so the Pequot War and King Philip's War were two examples of culmination of tensions between Native Americans and English colonists based on like encroachment, and as European or English ways increasingly disrupted their life. So the Pequot War was, I actually didn't know Pequot and King Philip's War were different, but the Pequot War, New England soldiers massacred the Pequot tribe, and they sold the surviving natives to Caribbean slavery. And basically the European dominance and warfare convinced colonists that they were on a holy quest and that the natives were unworthy of sharing the land. So basically, New England soldiers massacred a Pequot tribe. They sold them off to slavery, and then this convinced them that they were holy, and that the natives were unholy to share the land with. And then King Philip's War, basically Puritans attacked a lot of Native American settlements, and they killed men, women, children of the villages, and the Native Americans could not take this anymore. There's like no end to the brutality expansion, so a Wampanoag leader named Metacom, or the Christianized King Philip name, he launched attack against the English. He destroyed a lot of colonist towns, and this was actually the bloodiest war in terms of percentage in American history. Like even more than the Civil War, I think, like 5 to 10%. So, but in the end, the English prevailed, and this basically kind of wiped out like Native American resistance. Not wiped out, but very stunted. Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, he super wanted a city upon a hill, which is based on American exceptionalism, that America is so godly and special that it is modeled to other nations. Anne Hutchinson, she was banished because she basically said, we don't need ministers to interpret the Bible, we can interpret it ourselves. So Puritans did not like that, so they banished her. She she tried to go somewhere, but then she was killed with her 13 kids by some Native Americans. But she basically claimed to have like direct experience, direct like personal relationship with God. And so as the colony aged, there was like a decreased religious zeal for Puritans. Like their children were not as religiously zealous as they were, so membership declined. And it was really hard to become a Puritan or become baptized, because you needed it was a very strict conversion experience. You need to have a direct like relationship with God, or like a very like religious conversion experience. So the 1662 halfway covenant made it so that basically you didn't need such strict things. And then so in 1689 they united New York, Jersey, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, Rhode Island into a single super colony, which is the Dominion of New England under Sir Edmund Andros. And the colonists hated him and he hated them. It was just like he threatened he threatened their liberties and basically really like hammered down on control. They also did the Salem witch trials, which was basically like highlighted the craziness and like religious like fervor, I guess. Plymouth was the Pilgrims. So Pilgrims are separatists. They want to separate from the Anglican Church because they believe it cannot be fixed, unlike Puritans who believe that the church can be fixed. They created the Mayflower Compact, which was the first like governing democratic document on the Mayflower. And basically they said like, oh, we'll listen to majority votes. And William Bradford became the governor. They survived their first winter thanks to Squanto. Connecticut, Rhode Island. Roger Williams also was banned from the Puritans, so he founded Rhode Island, where he welcomed like dissenting Puritans. Southern colonies, these were super West African slavery. And although slavery developed slowly in North America, it was super, super rapid in West Indies, where the enslaved black population outnumbered the free white population, which meant it was very important to have harsh slave codes that would like keep the slaves under control because they outnumber the white people. So a lot of West Indies people brought their way of plantation cultures to North America, to South Carolina, for example. They had where those colonies had very long, warm growing seasons, which is perfect for large-scale plantation. They did cash crops like tobacco, indigo, rice, cotton, and basically African slaves were super, super important to this economy, which would later lead to the Civil War because increasing diverging views about slavery. And slavery becomes very ingrained in the Southern way of life. Carolina, there was a slavery revolt called the Stono Rebellion, which resulted in a stricter slave code. Georgia, basically James Oglethorpe, he wanted to found like a reform for England's like prisoners or those in debt. So instead of languishing away in England's cells, they would come over to Georgia and like work. Poor and destitute, slavery, prison reform. Unit 3, big thing, is the Enlightenment. So Enlightenment is basically a movement that started in England that because of the robust transatlantic trade and transatlantic print culture, made its way over to America. So thinkers of Enlightenment believe in progress, like freedom of thought, rationalism, education of the masses, liberty to everyone. Thomas Paine, he basically wrote Common Sense, which basically said we should break away from England. A smaller landmass should not control a bigger one. Like, that doesn't make sense. And he basically wrote this in a way that was easier for common people to understand. John Locke wrote The Social Contract, which is basically like, he had ideas, social contract, like natural rights of life, liberty, and property that were given by God and cannot be taken over by government, by king, for example. Social contract is that, like, consent of the governed. Basically, government derives its power from the people under it. So if the government does not protect the people's rights, the people have the right to overthrow the government. Thomas Hobbes, secularism, deism, I don't really know, but First Great Awakening, another big thing of Unit 3, and basically it was a reaction to the Enlightenment thought, and let me actually have some better notes on the First Great Awakening. So, Great Awakening, preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, they basically preached very passionately. They traveled across state lines. They delivered sermons outside, churches, roads, fields. And George Whitefield, in particular, is known for starting the practice of preaching outside because the church wouldn't give him a pulpit. And these, the feelings of the Great Awakening really implanted feelings of, self-empowerment into the colonial mindset and emphasized their own individuals and feelings and a personal connection with God. And this religious passion awoken by Whitefield eventually translated into political passion. So, So the effect was that instead of accepting faith as tradition, Americans felt free to choose their own religious domination or own religious affiliation. So this led to many new religious denominations being founded. And by the 1760s, there was a lot of religious diversity in every colony. And the idea that salvation was available to anyone directly from God, regardless of their race, their gender, their economic class, their status. This made church a very thoroughly democratic experience, which would translate politically as well. People became more tolerant. So instead of seeing each other as a member of a very different religious group, they saw themselves as just Americans who shared convictions about virtue and united in opposition against anybody who denied them their rights or denied them or told them how to think, feel, or behave. So Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening were two big things that kind of influenced colonial thought and almost created to an extent a national identity prior to the American Revolution. The 7 Years' War is another big one. Basically, both Great Britain and France, they claimed ownership to land in the Ohio River Valley, so land disputes in the Ohio River Valley led to fights, and this led to the start of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is also called Proto-War, World War Zero, in fact, because it's a very imperial war where they fought over land holdings, which was away from both participants. Mercantilism is a theory that basically you should have favorable balance of trade. You should export more than you import. You should have colonies because they can provide you raw materials and they also serve as a market for your manufactured goods. They also bought back finished goods. So, also more on the French and Indian War. So, French and Indian War was quite important. I don't know if I have a big one for it, but I don't have one for the French and Indian War. Actually, I do. So, French and Indian War, basically the outcome was that France is kicked out of North America and Britain is the only major superpower there. So, but it also left Britain in extreme debt, a lot of debt to pay for the war. So in order to mitigate their financial woes, they promptly terminated the policy of salutary neglect. So salutary neglect was basically there were navigation acts, but Britain wasn't enforcing them. It was very loosely enforced. A lot of smuggling happened, and Britain kind of turned a blind eye because they were we're still making profits. Let's just let them do what they're doing. So this termination manifested in a suite of new taxes, colonial taxes. So now we're really at the eve of the American Revolution. So basically, almost all at once, colonists lost the privileges of their relatively free trade and also free trade and free commerce before the war. And they especially hated the Stamp Act, which basically generated taxes by directly taxing all paper products like playing cards, stuff like that. And they responded to this tax in both violent and non-violent ways. The Sons of Liberty, organized by tarring and feathering tax collectors, Daughters of Liberty boycotted British goods. And these basically energized the colonies with rebellious fervor. There was a bunch of other anti-taxation sentiments. Stamp Act. This also set a precedent for the later organized resistance to British taxes and authority. So basically, Stamp Act was a big thing that led to really organized resistance to Britain, such as the Continental Congress. So they would organize boycotts. Basically, big thing, organized boycotts, and which ultimately led to the repeal of some taxes. But also more taxes were passed, like the tea tax, and a bunch of other things. In fact, the colonists responded to the tea tax very famously with the Boston not the Tea Party overthrowing of the Boston Harbor, where they dressed up as Native Americans and threw a lot of tea into the Boston Harbor. And this really harmed the British economy. It also placed, I think it placed New England, or took away their charter, Boston. It closed the Boston port. It did Quartering Act. It passed like the, what was the response to the Boston Tea Party? Yeah, they passed the Intolerable Acts, which basically was designed to punish Massachusetts by closing the Boston Harbor, restructuring the government, quartering, and this just pissed them off even more. So, yeah, also one thing to note is that in 1754, Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which was rejected but would later be used as a cartoon in the American Revolution as well. Basically, they were like, oh, we need to unify for defense, and they just rejected it. Yep. So, yeah, Dominion of New England. This was an attempt established by King Charles II to tighten England's control in colonies. And after the Glorious Revolution, where they overthrew King James II, the people in Dominion of New England, all the way North America, overthrew Sir Edmund Andros. Salutary neglect was just like loose trade. Proclamation of 1763. So after the 7 Years' War, the Britain gained a lot of land, obviously, and colonists were eager to settle that land and expand westward because they thought, oh, I fought the war, like we should get the spoils of the war. However, Britain was a little concerned about like Native American conflicts, so they issued the Proclamation of 1763, which basically prohibited colonist settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, I think, west of the Appalachian Mountains, which basically upset so many colonists because they were like we fought the war, we need to claim it, and they moved anyways. They like just defied the law, but this was a major like point of kind of like sore point. Yeah, let me see if I have anything on that actually. I just don't know if I do, but yeah. Royal Proclamation of 1763. This was a key grievance, and British limitations on the colonists became a key rallying point, and the representatives began correspondence and realized that their new common enemy was Britain. Let's go back. Writs of Assistance Stamp Act, obviously. This led to the Stamp Act Congress, which was the first unified colonial response to British policy, and colonial thinkers such as Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Adams were most prominent in the debate against the Stamp Act, and this opposition birthed the phrase "no taxation without representation," which talked about the idea of virtual representation. So virtual representation was like a British attempt to pacify the no taxation without representation. They basically said, oh, you do have representation, like our people represent the entire British Empire, like not. So while they don't have a direct representative, the people that are in British Parliament represent everyone. And that did not pacify the colonists at all. And then 1776, I think Parliament repealed the Stamp Act and they passed the Declaratory Act, which is basically like, oh, like we can still do whatever we want, we're just not doing it. And then Townshend Acts, just another wave of taxes on like like glass, lead, paint, imported stuff, like everyday things, which again angered the colonists. And 1770 propagandist Boston Massacre basically intensified anti-British sentiment. Paul Revere, who's a very accomplished propagandist, he produced a very famous like drawing, like a wood carving of the incident, which was British redcoats unpromptly firing on an unarmed crowd of American workers, which fanned the flames of revolution. Samuel Adams urged Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence to rally against opposition to British colonies. Tea Act, British Tea Act, Boston Tea Party, direct response to the Tea Act. So, and the British responded by their coercive or intolerable acts, which we already talked about, Quartering Act. In response to the intolerable acts, they called for the First Continental Congress. So, by this point, they still thought of themselves as loyal British citizens. They were just a little critical of England's authority in the colonies, but they didn't directly challenge their loyalty to the British crown. And they also passed, common sense, Thomas Paine, this was like kind of the first thing that really said, like, oh, we gotta fight back. British Empire Strikes Back, which is basically Lexington Conquer, was the first shot heard around the world between Britain and America, start of the American Revolution, and even right now, like the Second Continental Congress was convening, and George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army, but they were still authorizing like the all petition branch. Like there was still like one last chance, Britain, like, do we want to break up? Do we want to not? And basically King George III was like, he didn't even read the petition. He was just like no. So July 4th, 1776, Congress issued the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson to Britain, and this was the first time the colonies intended to be fully independent of the mother country. Articles of Confederation, basically they were super weak. I don't even know if basically, yeah, the articles are super, super weak, and let me see if articles. Yeah, Articles of Confederation, basically they had just kind of gotten out of British monarchy rule, so they want a very weak central government. Prevalence of ideas about self-governance led to formation of a weak central government under the Articles of Confederation. But the things that the Articles of Confederation did do good was, thing they did do good was that they actually banned slavery in like some new territories. For example, let me talk about it if I can just find it. Republican motherhood. The idea that women are vital to democracy and they need to be educated to like raise well democratic sons. Articles of Confederation. So yeah, they did the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which made like public education, also abolished slavery in the Northwest Territory, provided a way for Western territories to gain a population and apply for statehood. So this was like kind of like the only good thing of the Articles of Confederation. But a thing that basically led to its downfall was Shays' Rebellion, which was farmers after fighting the Revolutionary War. They were heavily in debt and they weren't paid, so their like houses were foreclosed. So Daniel Shays gathered a military, and Massachusetts tried to there was no president, no federal army to help them. So this showed the weakness of the articles. This led to the Constitutional Convention, which basically was like, oh, we need to create like a new constitution. There's two plans: the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan. New Jersey plan was like, oh, unicameral, we need equal representation for every state because New Jersey's small. Virginia was like, it should be based on population because Virginia's big. So this led to the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Plan, which was made by Roger Sherman. This created a bicameral legislature, which was two houses, which was House of Rep, which is based on population, and the Senate, which was based on equal representation, and also the 3/5 compromise, which was basically like 3/5 slaves count as 3/5 of a person, which, yeah, and then they also did they can't ban slavery until 1808. So, for ratification, Federalists really wanted ratification, and they wrote like these three people: Hamilton, Madison, Jay. They wrote the Federalist Papers. Hamilton wrote the other 51, and basically anti-Feds were like, no, this is too much power in the central government. We need protection of our own rights. So basically the Federalists were like, oh, we'll give you your rights, we'll give you your Bill of Rights, but ratify it first, and that's what they did. So federalism is just sharing power between the state and national government, checks and balances, etc., etc. Basically, 10th Amendment was like, oh, any powers we didn't list in Article 1, Section 8, we give to the states. And then shaping a new republic, cabinet, yeah. American Constitution, Bill of Rights, Federalist Papers. George Washington was elected as America's first president in 1788. He set a lot of precedents, like 2 terms. In his farewell address, he warned against American people forming political parties and developing entanglements with other European countries. He was basically like, we did those things anyways. there's also Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton created a whiskey tax, which incited another whiskey rebellion, which was reminiscent of Shays' Rebellion. But this prompted President Washington to create a huge force to push it down. It was like into like a gnat crushing, like a sledgehammer crushing a gnat. And the rebellion proved to Federalists that democracy was in the hands of ordinary citizens. What? The trade just dropped?
Yeah.
Why?
Are you talking to someone?
No, I'm making a video for myself. Okay. And then John Adams was elected second president. He basically did the Alien Sedition Acts, which were basically like, you cannot say anything bad about our Federalists. And it made it harder for immigrants to vote and gain citizenship and reduce free speech. And in response to these Alien Sedition Acts, Madison and Jefferson wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which was basically like, these acts are unjust, unconstitutional. This is like a first example of like nullification, which would later become prominent during Andrew Jackson, nullification theory. But they basically, Jefferson's draft said that states could nullify federal laws, but this was deleted. XYZ affair also happened, which was basically like, unknown French representatives demanded huge bribe, which led to the quasi-war between U.S. and France. Democratic Republicans, super strict constructionalism. Thomas Jefferson was one of them. They interpreted the Constitution literally. They were really concerned with individual freedoms and states' rights. Federalists were like elite, industrial. Democratic Republicans like agrarian society. Unit 4, Industrial Revolution. So this is quite long. It's already 41 minutes. So I'm going to stop it here and we're going to pick off next time on Unit 4. Thank you.